Good evening and welcome to tonight's program featuring author Catherine Clinton on her book, Mrs. Lincoln, A Life. My name is Phyllis Evans and I am the Senior Director of Development for the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library Foundation. And tonight's interview will be conducted by our Foundation President and CEO, Erin Carlson Mast. Before we begin our program this evening, I'd like to thank each of you for joining us. We have really enjoyed bringing the webinar series to you in your homes during the past year, including some amazing authors, historians, and historical interpreters. And tonight we are thrilled to welcome author Catherine Clinton. Following tonight's presentation, we will entertain questions from the audience. Please type your questions in the Q&A box below, and we will get to as many as possible. And now I would like to welcome Erin Mast, who will make the introduction of tonight's guest and get this program started. Erin?
Thank you so much, Phyllis. We are so delighted to be joined by Dr. Catherine Clinton today. Catherine Clinton holds the Denman Chair of American History at the University of Texas, San Antonio, and is also Professor Emerita at Queen's University, Belfast. Clinton has authored or edited over 30 books on historical subjects, including Mrs. Lincoln, A Life, Harriet Tubman, The Road to Freedom, and Stepdaughters of History, Southern Women and the American Civil War. She won a Guggenheim in 2016 and has served as president of both the Southern Historical Association and the Southern Association for Women Historians. She has been elected to the Society of American Historians, was a consultant for Steven Spielberg's Lincoln, and serves as co-editor of the University of Georgia Press series, History in the Headlines, which published her edited volume, Confederate Statues and Memorialization, in 2019. Catherine, it's so good to see you again.
It's great to see you, Erin.
One of the things our members really enjoy hearing about is what drew our speakers to the idea of pursuing history or public history as a career. Can you please tell us to get started about your path to history?
Well, I think that I came very late to history. That is, that I had 2 degrees before I earned my PhD at Princeton, but I was very interested in the world about me, about the social conflicts going on. And the day before my 16th birthday, the nation erupted into a firestorm over the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. So I asked a lot of questions about it. When I went off to college, I found that people were talking about changes in race relations. And of course, I was entering into the hallowed halls of Harvard, one of the first groups of women to go and live in the Harvard houses, and in a way, the integration of the sex into male colleges was something I was aware of. And history was a very male-dominated profession when I entered it in the 1970s. So I was very interested in issues relating to women, relating to race. And it's very lucky for me that these 2 issues were a bubble. So although my early degrees were in African American studies and American studies, by the time I was engaged in questions, historical questions, I felt the profession was well along toward raising these questions that interested me so much. And of course, I was affected by growing up in Kansas City, a border state, and where the issues relating to the Civil War were somewhat present. I tell the story that my father was so interested in the Civil War centenary that I went along and always won the prize as the youngest person at any event. So I was sort of a Civil War mascot, and I never thought I would return to it, but being a student of James McPherson's led me down that path to being very interested. Biography, of course, was something that when I was a young student, we would read these orange biographies and we would get points for all we read in grade school. And I think biography is a wonderful pathway into the past. So that is really my story of how I came to be so interested in history.
I love that, Catherine. I remember there was a head of state that visited President Lincoln's cottage when I was there who said, I always read biography because life is too short to make all of our own mistakes. It's important to learn from others. And they did that through biography. You have done such incredible work highlighting underrepresented perspectives, including those of women, and particularly of women in the South. And I'm including Harriet Tubman and Mary Lincoln in the group of Southern women since they were born south of the Mason-Dixon line. How have you chosen the topics for your research and books? And how did what you learned over the course of your work change your own perspective about 19th century American women in particular?
Well, I have to say that I was very fascinated as an undergraduate in women's diaries, and many of them were published, but some were actually quite controversial. So I have a lecture that I often give about Mary Chestnut, whose diary was greatly appreciated. It's now become, I think, the most cited Civil War diary, and her voice is so dynamic. I also was very interested in Fanny Kemble, who was a very controversial person in her own time. She was a playwright, and she wrote fiction as well as publishing her own journals. But I was terribly fascinated by the voice of these women, and I wanted to get more voices out. And naturally, going through the 1970s and into the 80s, and doing my undergraduate work in African American studies at Harvard, which was then a growing field. And I later joined the faculty, and Henry Louis Gates has come to Harvard and built that department into an international powerhouse. And I was wondering, where are these voices of African American women? We can find them in the slave narratives, but slowly there's been a great revival of that interest. The Schomburg Library of African American Women, which was a project Gates was doing in the 80s, showed us that there are buried treasures and manuscripts. And so it was important to me, for example, to take the life of Susie King Taylor and to try and reissue through the University of Georgia Press her diary, her telling her tale. She was the only Black woman to serve with the Union Army, to publish her voice. And it's, I think, so important. Noble women as well was one of the quotes I took from her diary. And therefore, it led me to see that there were so many ways that we could unpack the lives of these women, but also we can rediscover. And to my great sorrow, in the 21st century, I discovered that Harriet Tubman was the subject of scores of children's books, but there hadn't been an adult biography of her in over 40, 50 years. So I made it my duty to follow this. But I will say, for example, I did work a lot on Southern women, and in my first book, I traveled to archives from California to Boston and many stops in between. But when I had my own children, I found the research was slowed down when I did a calculation of how many care hours it would cost me to go through the court martials when I was working on a particular topic. And so I did indeed pick some of my subjects because of the amazing archives that I could go into. And working on someone like Harriet Tubman was not an archival choice. And working on someone like Mary Lincoln, who has been well documented, was an interpretive choice. So I guess you can say that I like the challenge of working on those women who we may think we know, but maybe there's something else. You mentioned that Mary was born in the South, and I do tend to emphasize in my own biography the Southernness of her life, as I do about Abraham Lincoln himself, when he once apologized to a young Black coming into the White House and demanding equal wages. He said, "I am by birth a Southerner." So I thought it was interesting to think about the Southernness of these women that I was working on.
Yeah, well, and I want to, we are going to mainly focus on the Mary Lincoln biography you wrote, but if for anyone who hasn't read the Harriet Tubman book, I really encourage you to do so too. And referencing the fact that a lot of the books on Harriet Tubman have been children's books, and that's certainly true of the books I have for my own children here.
Sure.
She's represented. I'm not sure that many of our listeners know that you also wrote a children's book about the accomplished poet Phyllis Wheatley. And that subject matter is obviously in your wheelhouse, even though the format's a little bit of a departure to you. What inspired you to write a children's book?
Well, when I was pregnant with my first child, I was asked to do some consulting on a textbook series. and I looked into what the social science textbook series were. And then when my own children were coming of age, I would look in the public library to look at biographies. And I found, for example, for African Americans, over 50%, 60%, 70% of the biographies were of sports figures or entertainers. And I was really concerned about that. Obviously, I wanted to take my knowledge of African American history and try and get it into the textbooks. So I was pleased to work on a textbook series, We the People, and we put out a series of biographies for kindergartners. We said, we can get these stories out. And I think that at one particular point in time, I was being discussed by a colleague at another university and said, well, who can take someone seriously who writes for children? And I was really taken aback, because I think we have to get history on the ground floor. Textbooks are so important. And therefore, I became quite interested. I actually have written a book about Harriet Tubman. It's called When Harriet Met Sojourner, because
that's right.
Because I kept getting so many requests to review new revised children's books on Harriet Tubman that I finally just would say, no, I'm sorry, I'm working on my own. And I did find it very interesting that these two women once met. We have no record of their meeting, so it was an imagined way of getting at their stories. But those are great to work on. It's just that my career has taken me to different places, and therefore I end up doing subjects often about where I am located, often about places where I'm inspired by the stories. So when I was at the Citadel, for example, visitor for a year, I worked quite heavily on the first Memorial Day, which took place in Charleston. It's something that my good friend David Blight has written about, and it was wonderful to have him come down for a ceremony, and then eventually a marker was dedicated. And so you mentioned public history, and I would say that getting the word out to children, getting the word out to the general audience, and certainly having wonderful groups like your own keep alive the words and the meanings of the life of the Lincolns is something I'm committed to.
Yeah. Catherine, you mentioned that your decision to write a biography on Mary Lincoln was an interpretive choice. Can you explain more about what that matter of interpretation was?
Sure. I can say that, first of all, I was being lured in to the Lincoln world. It is a wonderful place, although I've learned about Lincolnistas. They often have their camps and their followings, and it really is a very rambunctious group of scholars, and of course, a very rambunctious group of readers out there. But I was quite concerned about the run-up to the bicentennial, in that there were books being planned on Abraham Lincoln, right, left, and center. And as many of us have commented, there was a book a week published on Lincoln by major publishers, university publishers. At the same time, I was aware that the reputation of Mary Lincoln was suffering, that there were, I thought, quite limited interpretations of her. And so I decided that as the last biography was over 20 years old, it might be worth it to take another look. And I did find that I was reviewing a book that was on Mrs. Keckley and Mrs. Lincoln, and I wasn't very moved by that particular interpretation. I thought that there were some other things that I could add to it. But I do tell people that it's a bit different when you're up against such a wall of interpretation and scholarship. So Mary Lincoln was in some ways, flattened, and it was my job to somehow, not to put things right, but to try, and I was arguing against a literature that was quite condemnatory, quite, I think, frivolous. And, as I said, she was the most condemned, the most written about, the most scorned, until Hillary Clinton as a first lady. So I do think that, and I was writing in that era, so I was trying to think about the way in which the press, contemporary press, can deal with it, and then what led to her interpretation so many years later. And of course, exploring it, I found it was wonderful. There's a Mary Lincoln world. There's the Mary Lincoln Coterie. There are many groups who look to her quite seriously as someone who was indeed the first inhabitant of the White House to really be the first lady, to be the wife of the president and take on that role. But I was quite interested in the fact that political partnerships were something we were thinking about. And some of the very wonderful new biographies of Lincoln do deal with that, the way in which her voice was critical and I would suggest crucial in order to have Lincoln realize his ambitions. I won't say having Lincoln realize his policies, because I did have a lot of scholars come to me and say, now, did Mary Lincoln make Lincoln do this? Did Mary Lincoln influence Lincoln this way? And I really think that it would have to be pure speculation, but I think I gave a lot of material in my book to suggest that she was indeed crucial, that she was an ingredient that helped him reach his fuller potential.
Yeah, that's, I guess one of my next questions then would be, how would you characterize the relationship between Mary and Abraham Lincoln?
I think it was much less tempestuous than a new biography suggests. I would have to say that. I would also have to say that I think that I, of course, was surprised at a lot of the material that I found, because Mary Lincoln was not joined with women's rights movements during her era. So labeling her a feminist or making her first feminist is, I think, a kind of retrofitting that I don't usually like to participate in. But I do believe that she was ahead of her time, that she was better educated than her husband, was in pursuit of education. She was also in pursuit of the 19th century romantic ideal. That is, that marriages were arranged, marriages were compacts in a previous era, but she really wanted to find someone who she could love and respect. And she did become attached to Abraham Lincoln against family advice, against the advice of friends. And they had a lot to overcome in their relationship, not to mention that we now know that Lincoln suffered deeply from melancholy, that we can argue and debate, as scholars have over the past decade or so, about the extent of his depressions, the extent of his mental setbacks during his political life. But I still think that she was someone who many people commented was able to lift Abraham Lincoln, was able to soothe him during his long, bleak periods. And she herself suffered from many bleak periods. I believe that they came together somewhat because they both lost their mothers at an early age. They both felt very much abandoned. I mean, Lincoln himself was completely abandoned with his sister in a cabin when his father went off to find a new wife. And Mary was pushed out of her family home and went to live with her sister in Illinois, as there was a parade of Todd girls getting married, sisters getting married before she did. She was out of order. The Jane Austen model didn't fit. So I think that she was someone who related quite well. But then we can see during their early years in Springfield, there was a lot of tension around his, shall we say, absent-mindedness, pulling the child in the wagon and leaving him a block behind, his indulgences in many ways. It seems that Mary was more of a disciplinarian than he was, but they both were mad for the children. And I see that as something that held them together, as was their shared grief over losing first Eddie in Springfield and later Willie in the White House. There was, I think, a tenderness between the two of them that came up in many of their letters. And it's such a tenderness that it escapes me that anyone could imagine that they were not deeply deeply bonded throughout their marriage. And we know, for example, his very last words to his wife involved his being so attached to her. What would people think of them sitting in the presidential box? And I think, therefore, they were completely fated. Mary channeled her political ambitions into her husband. Mary was a 19th century wife par excellence. She was not as obedient, I think, as his male circles would have appreciated. She often tried to interfere with appointments. She held a grudge longer than anyone. And I can say that I think she had an incredibly volcanic temper. And
Yeah.
she was nicknamed by his secretaries the Hellcat. And I don't think that there's any way to not admit that she could at times be unreasonable. But I tried in my way to search out what might be some of the contributing factors to this. So her least attractive behavior seems to have happened in public a couple of times, and I'm able to track it back to what was going on with her in terms of her migraines, what was going on in terms of her temperament. For example, her biggest fit was in a military parade in 1865, and it was reported widely by both Mrs. Grant and a military officer who witnessed her having a complete meltdown. We also know that during that period, her elder son, Robert, was off serving with Grant, and Mrs. Lincoln and Mr. Lincoln disagreed on whether her son should serve in the Army. And therefore, I think they had a real impasse, which contributed to tension between the two of them during that particular period. And I'm not saying that it wasn't ill-advised, it wasn't terrible that she behaved this way. I'm simply saying I tried to look for some contributing factors, and I didn't find others giving credence to what a deep gulf it was between the two of them. I will say that I was pleased that Tony Kushner and Steven Spielberg included that in their interpretation of the Lincolns, because I thought it was a very telling, tender insight into their relationship. So there were moments where you saw her being imperious and difficult, and you also saw moments where the two of them could be tender. And that, I think, is the way many marriages go.
I've always appreciated that you provide that context and look sort of at the complexity of the situation, whereas what I've found is a lot of questions I've gotten about Mary Lincoln over the years tend to look at an incident or a symptom without taking into account what was happening in the background. That happens with Abraham Lincoln as well. I think not understanding what was happening in the context of a day can completely change your perspective on what might have been happening. But it seems like with Mary Lincoln, I've at least experienced more of a inclination for folks to take a one-dimensional view maybe of her, in part because that's the dominant narrative, or had been for many years before.
Certainly when I started my book and when I started giving talks and lectures, and even after the book tour, the number one question always began, was she crazy?
That's the exact same thing and
right.
I think that once you start to contextualize even the loss, like you were talking about, but also ambitions that were partially realized but not fully, the level of frustration becomes more clear. Ambition has always seemed like a good word to use to describe both Mary and Abraham Lincoln, especially with political ambitions. And in reading about how ambitious Mary was, I've often been struck by the dichotomy between the ideal of this achievement of the road to the White House, and then the reality that something that should have been so triumphant was instead marred by secession, chaos, threats against Lincoln's life, completely overshadowed even by her own family members joining the Confederacy, for example. And then I'd like to hear from you how the reality of Mary Lincoln's White House and post-White House life compared to the life that she had been planning and preparing for.
There was
And the one last thing I'll say is, even, you know, you talk about those last few tender things he said, and you have the surrender at Appomattox, and then he's murdered in front of her. So,
right. I was so struck by the gap between image and reality, because she had a powerful imagination, such a powerful imagination that I think, for example, when she was entering her pew in the Presbyterian church, she would see the other ladies turning to look at her. And that's why she always bought the entire bolt of cloth, so that no one else would get the same material. So she was very vain. She was someone who, within 24 hours of entering the White House, found a dressmaker. It was Elizabeth Keckley, because she heard that she was the best. And who did she hear that from? Of course, it was the wives of Southern senators, who would use someone who was a modiste, someone who later would become her great confidant and friend until the breakup after the war. And we have to look at the way in which she had a vision of herself, and the people who would share that vision of herself and her husband, she would bring into her circle. So her older sister, Elizabeth, who had served in a maternal role and had married the son of the governor, was someone who was a substitute mother for her. She and Lincoln were married in that parlor in the Edwards home. And when they were going off for the inauguration, she brought along relatives from Springfield, including some of those Southern relatives who came up from Alabama. So they were seeing that Mary made good with her lanky lawyer from the plains. And she thought of herself, of course, as coming from one of the finest families in Kentucky. And therefore, she had ambassadors and governors, and her own father was a leading politician. And she very much believed in this image. And Lincoln, of course, knew that Mary hobnobbed with Henry Clay, his great hero. And therefore, the fact that when she was younger, she wanted to go to the White House with Clay meant that she got to get there with Lincoln. But many people surmise that it might have been her goal to get there. So when she does finally arrive, as you point out, on the way, she and her husband have to separate to get to Washington, D.C. because of the threats. She was continuously alarmed, frightened. She was one of the people that pushed to have guards, that pushed to have a Capitol Police force guarding the president. She was someone who very much was alarmed. And when she tried to ignore the threats, the clouds on the horizon, she was ridiculed. All of her mail was searched before it went into the White House, and anything she wrote was read on the way out. People called her a rebel because of her Southern birth, because of her Confederate relatives. So she was very suspect. I was struck once when I was in a Massachusetts great estate out in the Western out in the Berkshires, and there was a beautiful photo of a contemporary of Franklin Delano Roosevelt and his Japanese bride, because there had been in the early part of the 20th century a kind of alliance, and there were several of these scions of wealthy American families that married Japanese brides. And I thought, what if Franklin Roosevelt had married a Japanese bride, and she'd been in the White House at the time of the bombing of Pearl Harbor? Now, that was just a fleeting imaginary thought, but you have to take that and translate it back the way in which in the 19th century, people spoke about the Southerners as a different race. They were the Normans as opposed to the Northern Anglo-Saxons. So there was Mary, instead of going in triumph, and Lincoln did indeed see it as her triumph. He ran home from the telegraph office saying there's a woman there who I think might be more interested in this than even I am, and said, "We are elected, Mary." And I think that meant that he too saw it in some ways as something that they would share. And yet within weeks, they were not sharing in a way that she had envisioned. She tried to get him on daily excursions to get him fresh air, because she saw the transformation as his eyes became hollow, as he would maybe eat an apple for lunch and try and skip breakfasts and dinners in order to work long into the night or early in the morning in order to deal with the business of the nation splitting apart. And the more she tried to ignore it, the more she tried to invest in the nation that her husband had been elected to lead, the more she was critiqued for her shopping, for her trying to restore the White House, since there was furniture there from the Monroe era, since it had been really, in some ways, turned into a shabby place. Some of her Springfield relatives said it looked like a third-rate hotel. So she was determined to turn it into a grand showplace, and it was neither the time nor the place for redecorating. But once she got that into her head, it was very difficult to dislodge her from her plan. She wanted to win over Southerners in Washington. The ones who left behind were the social group in the middle of DC. They were called the cave dwellers, and she was determined to prove that she wasn't some rube from the plains. She wasn't the loud, vulgar woman that Harriet Lane, James Buchanan's niece, described. Instead, she was a very refined hostess, but she was losing that battle as fewer and fewer people attended the social scene. And one of the few who did come was Kate Chase, the governor's daughter, who was her great rival. And indeed, that was hard for her because she saw it as a social triumph, but what had to happen was a series of tragedies, I think, led her to see supporting her husband during his time of need, trying to hold him together at a time when the nation was splitting apart, was her primary job.
Yeah, yeah. Well, and a bit of context, if I remember this correctly from your book, is that while the Lincolns were Abraham Lincoln was very sensitive to the idea of spending money on redecorating the White House, fixing it up, that the amount allocated was, I think, if I'm remembering this correctly, equivalent to what was spent on a mural in the Capitol.
There was one picture for they were actually refurbishing the government buildings at the time of his presidency, and so it was of interest to me that $25,000 was what they had given the White House for completely refurbishing, and then there was one painting for the Capitol that was $20,000. So I was trying to give some context. Of course, when she overspent, he was furious and said it would stink in the nostrils of the nation if these flub dubs were being bought when the poor soldiers didn't have enough blankets. So the extension of the money was slipped through the next January because Mary always felt that Lincoln didn't always understand how these financial issues were, but he certainly understood bad publicity. And she was, in many ways, the thatch on the roof. And if you want to disturb a house, if you want to set it on fire, you start with the thatch. And I think attacking Mary was in many ways a way of getting at Abraham Lincoln. And it was said that she could not even ride in a carriage down the avenue, but the news was trilled on the telegraph throughout the nation. So really sort of tracking Mrs. Lincoln was a problem, that her every move was tracked and often misunderstood. She, for example, was encouraged by Hay and Nicolay that she should get some good publicity. She should let a reporter go with her to her hospital visits.
Yep.
And she didn't believe in that. She was so 19th century that it was a woman's birth and her marriage and her death that would appear in the press. And she did not covet the press. She indeed spent a long part of her life battling the press, and it went on quite cruelly after the death of her husband.
Yeah. How, one more question, then we'll go to audience questions because there are quite a few. We even, Catherine, had several members submit questions in advance of the program starting.
Wow, okay.
So that's not a usual thing. Usually they come in through the chat during the program. But one of the themes that we've talked about is loss. Loss of their mothers, loss of other dear family members, loss of several of their children, the fear of losing Robert, the fear of losing another child, the physical separation between other family members. How did losses shape and affect Mary Lincoln throughout her life?
Well, I have to be honest and say that it's quite clear that grief was a common emotion in 19th century America, that we look at the fact that the loss of a child was a statistical average. We look at the fact that women gave birth in fear for their own lives. And then when a child survived childhood, you would see that as a miracle statistically, even among the upper classes, but particularly in the South, the death in childbirth and the high death of infants was something that women lived with. But Mary's grief seemed very out of proportion. It was something that was commented on when she lost her Eddie. And it was also something that the Lincolns shared. Lincoln became involved with a local minister discussing the matter of an afterlife, the matter of death and its meaning. And then with the death of Willie in the White House, she really became quite unhinged. It's important to see, however, that in the first weeks in the White House, the death of Elmer Ellsworth, who came with them from Illinois, who was, in some way the family friend. She saw him like a son, and to watch his murder was absolutely devastating. But also, I tell in my book about the fact that the hotel owner, who Ellsworth was charging up the stairs of a Virginia hotel to take down the Confederate flag, and he was shot by a hotel owner. Then his men shot the hotel owner, who was the brother of one of Mary's family friends back in Kentucky. So there it was that you saw things coming apart. So the whole White House experience was a series of deaths, and Willie's was the light of the White House. He could lighten Lincoln's spirits. He was someone who was a favorite in Washington. Some of the poetry written and the letters from statesmen were so moving. And Lincoln would often go to the green room and commune, and he would speak to soldiers about losing his dear boy, his lost boy. He would talk about taking Taddy for buying some presents for he who was no longer with us. So we know they both shared that, but Mary really seemed incapable of recovering from her grief. Her sister had to come. There was talk that Lincoln took her to the window of the White House and looked over at St. Elizabeth's and said, if you do not improve, we will have to send you there. It was a new asylum. I've learned a lot about it because it's part of my new project, but it was a new asylum, federal mental institution built in 1855. And they built it mainly for the city of DC, but it became a military hospital, overcrowded with soldiers during that particular period. But it was known St. E's was not where you wanted to end up. And so she did pull herself together by going to hospitals, by doing more work. But the idea of Robert in any way fulfilling his dream of getting into this war, he had gone to Harvard, but he kept wanting to drop out like his classmates. And when he graduated, he didn't want to read law. And all of this really created in her this sense of high anxiety. She and Lincoln also told one another their dreams. And their dreams, of course, were let's travel to the middle, to the Holy Land. It wasn't the Middle East then. Let's travel to Palestine. We must travel. We must be so much more happy. But instead, I found that they were sharing dreams of a ship. They were sharing dreams of fires. They were sharing dreams of pistols. It's almost as though they had a great sense of prophecy. And although we know Mary became very involved with spiritualists, which many people think of as a fringe group, and indeed they were not the majority of Americans, but to think that so many millions were
Yeah.
subscribed in that movement. And as I point out, many more were spiritualists than abolitionists.
Yep.
And look at the war escalating. Wouldn't you want to be able to be in touch with your loved one who went to the other side? Wouldn't you want to feel that you could commune? And by 1863, Mary was feeling that her dead brother, half brother Alex, was talking to her dead son Eddie, and she had a great sense of the afterworld. And this really was frightening to people. And then during her post White House days, she became distraught, wandering. She once commented that if it weren't for her son Taddy, she would just slip away, meaning she was hinting at suicidal thoughts. But she did feel a great responsibility. And I'm very grateful that part of that responsibility was we forget that the Abraham Lincoln we know today is due in large part to the embellishment and enhancement of his reputation. And Mary really made it her job to tell the Lincoln story. She gave artifacts to not just Mrs. Keckley, but also the African-American family, the Slades who were connected. Many of his goods went to Wilberforce College. So his connection to the Emancipation Proclamation and the abolition of slavery was something that was very warmly celebrated by Mrs. Lincoln, which is why she gave a cane to Frederick Douglass. So we know that she felt it was very important that her husband's reputation be understood. And so she took quite seriously the role of first widow and was ever promoting his greatness. And she always referred to him as the martyr president. And it really, I think, wasn't until the great civil rights movement of the 1960s that we began to understand that Lincoln spoke out for Black soldiers to get the vote in his last speech at the White House. Was this not an act of paving the way for civil rights and paving the way for the kind of violence that this kind of pledge that America will fulfill its promise might instill?
Yeah, absolutely. We are going to turn to visitor or to audience questions because there's quite a few. So I'm going to start with one of the ones we got in advance. It's from Casey Picard, past president of the Friends of History from Portland State University. And she says hello to you.
Hello.
She asked, and she said, in chapter 14, with victory in view, you describe the Peterson House and the people allowed to participate in the vigil at Lincoln's deathbed. And so there are two questions here. First, was Robert Lincoln allowed to stay at the vigil after Secretary of War Stanton ordered his aides to keep his mother away from Lincoln in a nearby parlor? And understandably, Mary was upset at being separated from her dying husband. Didn't anybody at the vigil recognize that they were breaking tradition with normal Victorian deathbed rituals and adding to the trauma already suffered by Mary Lincoln?
Okay, the first question is about Robert. We know that Robert did come and Robert was allowed in. I make the argument it was a circle of men. Mm-hmm. It was men surrounding him. And we may feel that as we look at the deathbed image, or what, Harold Holzer has called the rubber room that gets bigger and bigger to hold all the people who were in and out during that night. But we do know that that Mary was becoming increasingly distraught because she wanted to see the recovery. In other words, she had a sense that he would recover, while the doctors, the Reverend, his circle knew that these were his dying hours. But her hysteria, the blood on the pillow and trying to keep it hidden in a sense, was something that could not be tolerated. And so when Stanton ordered her out and keep her in the parlor, it was to him an act of reverence. I will say that. And I will say that it was understood by women quite clearly that the deathbed vigil was their responsibility. It was something sacred, that you would be there to guide your loved one to the next world. And instead, to be banished was a horror and something that she in the moment couldn't recover from. She stayed there for hours afterward and did not want to return to the White House, and then returned to the White House, was unable to go to the funeral, she was, every time the catafalque was being built, it sounded like a gunshot and she would become traumatized again. She's clearly suffered from a form of PTSD over the having her husband slump on her blood there. It was a moment, an image that she lived with the rest of her life. And I do think that the idea that these men were cruelly barring her was a cruelty, because she was not popular. But at the same time, I have to say, I think that her behavior was so out of control, because as a wife doing the vigil, she should have instead, I think, been absorbed by prayer. But she later claimed she didn't know that he was dying. She had willed him to live. It was their moment of victory. So, but thank you for that question. Thank you.
So the second question is from Bob, and he says, you state in your book that President Lincoln was carrying a pistol the night he was assassinated. Can you share the evidence that you have for that?
My only evidence on that is talking to Tom Schwartz, who was the Illinois state historian when I was working on my book. And we were talking about the way in which I think I might have been commenting to him about Mary Lincoln later carrying a gun, and this was considered quite dangerous, that she might do either herself harm, or she was so angry with Robert after she was released from her year-long commitment to an asylum where she lost all her legal rights, that maybe she was going to do something with this pistol. And I was talking generally about carrying a pistol, and Tom confided to me that this was one of the least known facts about that night, that he himself was carrying a pistol. So I believe I included it in a footnote and didn't feature it in case that it was something going to be revealed in a later book by another scholar working on the assassination evening.
So the next question, Melissa notes that she recently read that Mary Lincoln corresponded with Queen Victoria, and she feels like in their later years, they shared many similarities in losing their husbands, sometimes emotional issues, feelings of abandonment, and maybe exploited and overprotected in Queen Victoria's case by their mothers. So she is curious about, to know if you know what their letters to each other included.
The only letter I know about is the letter that Queen Victoria wrote to Mary Lincoln, which I believe I include in total. And it is a very touching letter where she touches on her similarity, her knowledge of what it is to have such a loss. But I think it's quite clear to say that in 1961, when she lost her husband, she went into a cult of widowhood. And that was something that I think Mary emulated, admired, that Queen Victoria lived for her prince and was well known for this devotion. And I think this was a model that Mary wanted to model herself on. We do know that she did go to Scotland and went to Balmoral. The Queen was not there to greet her, but she nevertheless, I think, had a sense of connection, had a feeling that she and Victoria were kindred spirits, and that they had lost he whom they loved most. And we don't have other letters, I'm sorry to say. If we do, they haven't yet been uncovered. We do know that letters are always turning up, but I'm afraid we would have come across them sooner if there was an exchange of letters.
Franklin comments, I believe I've read that Mary Lincoln was buried alongside her husband until Robert Lincoln oversaw the arrangements for the present permanent tomb and had Mary buried elsewhere in the tomb. Is that correct? And if so, what are your thoughts on that?
I'm not elsewhere in the tomb, meaning that she was removed from the side of her husband. Yeah. I'm sorry, but I don't really know the details of that. I know that she wanted to be buried next to her husband, and she insisted that he be buried in the cemetery rather than in the very center of town, which was where the Springfield first fathers thought they should have a really good time with putting the Lincoln grave right in the center of town. But she said no, he wanted a quiet spot, and that's what she wanted as well. So I believe if you go there, you have a sense of them being together, whether it's side by side. I can't comment on that. Sorry, I'm not up on the exact gravesite. Apologies.
That's good. Okay. So question number 3 is from Mary, and it's about Robert's motivations. She asks, was Robert truly trying to help his mother by having her sent to the psychiatric hospital? And was she addicted to opiates?
I have a mixed view of Robert. Obviously, he has biographers who believe that he was a Victorian gentleman living by the protocol of the era and trying to truly protect his mother from further embarrassment and humiliation. Because by the time he saw her in 1875, following a very long, complicated train ride from Florida, where she was recuperating from one of her spells, we know that he was advised by his circle in Chicago to have her taken care of, because she was going to cause even more problems for herself and she might harm herself. And therefore, I think that he was motivated by that, putting her away. He wanted to place her with his aunt, Elizabeth. We now have some evidence that has been uncovered by Jason Emerson that she, Elizabeth Edwards, was undergoing an operation and couldn't take in her sister at that time, no matter whether she wanted to or not. She was just incapable of it. And we do know, however, she did take her in later, and she was released from her conservatorship that Robert had put her in while she was living in the Edwards home. I think that at the same time, there was a great deal of animosity because she had handpicked a Mary for Robert, and that was Mary Harlan. But over time, there was friction between the two Marys. And the difficulty Robert was put in was trying to keep his mother happy and trying to keep his wife, who didn't want her mother-in-law in the home, happy as well. So we had two very strong temperaments pulling on him during the episode of confinement. Some might call it incarceration. During that particular period, we know that Robert was taking the easiest path by putting his mother into a private institution where she received privileged care, and he felt that this would cure her. It instead made her more incensed. She sought legal counsel, and when she was released, she was extremely vengeful and wrote long, passionate letters about getting her property back, things that had been loaned to the family. She was quite vengeful. She did eventually reconcile, and I think the reconciliation was based in part on his ability to convince her that he was really trying to look out for her best interests. So they did share a bond. He was always referred to as the most Todd of the four sons.
Yeah. Fourth question, and we have a lot, so I'm going to try to get through a few of these.
Okay, I'll try and be shorter.
I'm loving this conversation, and I'm sure that all of our members in the audience are too. But the fourth question is about Nicolay and Hayes, the image they were attempting to project of Lincoln as they saw it in their biography of the president. And they ask, what effect, if any, did the biography have on Mary Lincoln's image?
Well, they were very unkind. They were very harsh. Mary used to go over all the politics of the day in the newspaper and his speeches, but these two fine young men took her place. I mean, she was used to having him seek her advice, but during the furor of war with counselors, with cabinet members, he really depended and became quite attached to these young men. And they saw her as someone who interfered with their relationship. So I would say that they were not predisposed to be kindly or even perhaps fair to Mary Lincoln and her role in the White House.
Thank you for that. Mark asks if it's true that the Grants didn't accept an invitation to Ford's Theater because Julia Grant could not stand Mary Lincoln.
I think that's pretty fair to say. I think Grant was influenced by his wife having this recent encounter, seeing Mary on a carriage ride. They got stuck in the mud. She banged her head so hard that it was said to have deranged her. By that, I think she was already in a full-blown migraine. And then when she got to the training ground, she had a full-blown meltdown. And this was something that Julia Grant had witnessed and been quite taken aback by, and wanted to keep her distance. She was fine for her husband to have a relationship with Abraham Lincoln, his commander-in-chief, but she didn't see any reason to in any way engage with Mary Lincoln.
Donna says that she loves the analogy of setting the roof on fire to destroy the house. And she asks separately that she was reading something that seemed to be defending William Herndon's biography of Lincoln and how, quote, reasonable, end quote, it was for him to assess the Lincoln marriage as, quote, unfortunate. And she wants to know your opinion on that.
Mary Lincoln was a well-known hostess. She could crowd 300 into that little house out in Springfield. If you go and see it, it's a miracle. She had dinners. She politicked with everyone. And there's no record of William Herndon ever being served a meal at the Lincoln Springfield home. It's quite clear that they were at odds with one another. It's quite clear that in the wake of his death, she was willing to engage with Herndon because she knew that he worshiped her husband and he would write a great, tribute to him. And so she spoke about religion and other issues to him. But the betrayal came with his writing and offering a lecture explaining that Lincoln had never loved Mary. It was his first love back in Salem that was the most important relationship he had. And therefore, this really was something that she could not forgive, that she never got over. And I think his biography reflected that permanent abyss between the two of them and his unwillingness to acknowledge what he knew, which is that everyone in Springfield knew their relationship was full of intellectual sparks, was full of intense political alliances, was manipulation and politicking. It was Mary. There was one point in the Spielberg film where she's sitting in the gallery, and it's in Congress because the film was set in '65. But I was really thinking of that Illinois State House where she was sitting up there marking everyone's support in the vote and could never forgive Julia Trumbull. Even though she'd been in her wedding party, because she knew that Julia Trumbull would have encouraged her husband to go up against Lincoln. And she was really calculating on these political issues.
I'm going to squeeze in one more question. Sorry, Phyllis, because we always try to end on time, but this is a really good one. And then we'll try to get some of the other ones answered maybe after the fact, if that's okay with you, Catherine, because one person's asking for book recommendations. And I think that'd be a great thing that we can send out afterwards. But
Sure.
Rick says it's his understanding that Mary was living in Chicago during the Great Chicago Fire. Has your research come across any information on that?
Oh, I wish I had more. I do, but it's quite a amazing thing because I did track that both Abraham and Mary had this real fear of fire. And they often wrote about there had been fires in Springfield, and therefore they were very alarmed about it. So imagine what it's like for her to come back from Europe with her son Tad, and they're settling in, back in Chicago. Tad dies in the summer, and then in the fall they have this utterly devastating wipeout fire. And I do know that Robert was taken up with trying to rescue the wife of one of the partners in his firm. He was being very gallant. We know that she was completely safe. But after that, I think the idea of keeping her goods in trunks in storage came up after the, during the fire and after the fire. She always wanted to preserve her things, her memories of Mr. Lincoln, which is why she traveled with 40 trunks to her sister's home, her final resting place.
Thank you so much, Catherine. That was wonderful.
Thank
Phyllis,
you.
I'm turning it back over to you. You're still on mute.
There we go,
There
technology.
we go.
Catherine and Aaron, thank you both so much for this engaging conversation on Mary Lincoln. When I read the book myself, I kind of found myself wanting to give Mrs. Lincoln a hug. She certainly endured some difficult standards or expectations, I guess you could say, during her time. And I think the topic of Mary Lincoln still holds a lot of questions for so many. Speaking of more questions, I did put your website in the Q&A box or the chat box earlier. It's www.catherineclinton.com. So if anyone still has follow-up questions that we don't get answered otherwise, you can reach out to her through that. If you haven't already registered for our upcoming webinars, then be sure to visit our website at alplm.org and sign up today. Next up, we have a delicious conversation with Ray, Catherine, Amy, as she shares the storytelling power of a good recipe just in time for the holidays. She will also be joined by our president and CEO, Aaron Carlson Mast. So mark your calendars for Wednesday, November 3rd at 7 p.m. and join us for that. Following that program, there is also a high-powered interview with authors Ron White and Talmadge Boston on Tuesday, November 30th. To register for either of these events or for more information on our webinar series, visit our website again at alplm.org. So as you close out tonight's webinar, you will see a short survey. So please take a moment to complete the survey. This helps us to improve our offerings to you and lets us know what you'd like to see in the future. As always, thank you to our members and supporters, everyone that's with us this evening. We are sincerely grateful for each and every one of you. We are excited to continue this online programming and look forward to seeing you all in the coming weeks. This concludes tonight's program. So everyone, please take care and we'll see you next time. Good night.